Going to be a really interesting series of talks. We cover a lot of topics in our water issues seminars, and this morning is going to be a confirmation of that. We're going to hear from six speakers, no less, who are going to give a lightning round of talks covering stream flow and nutrient loading, water temperature impacts to aquatic life, and our agency's new climate unit, among many other things. And so while I would normally take the time to introduce each of our speakers in turn, they are going to need the time to talk about all of this, and I can't wait to hear it. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Lee Ganske, and he's going to start us off with our first lightning talk. Lee, take it away.
Okay. Yes, indeed. I'm usually a cameras on guy, but my camera was acting sort of wonky this morning, so it's off real quickly by way of introduction. The inspiration for the format of today's forum came from Alyssa Bell, who is on the call today. Alyssa's an intern in our operations division, the environmental justice and engagement unit. Alyssa organized a panel this summer on um, youth climate anxiety. And one of the big takeaways for me from that panel was how a lot of the news on climate is pretty grim, and you'll hear some of that today. So the thought was, where we can, let's intersperse some more positive news if it's there. So we have talks that where we've interspersed areas where we have concerns about impacts to our surface waters from climate change with talks on some very positive policy and program developments at the local, state, and federal level, with talks on what you can do yourself personally. And these are not small things, but they are things that are necessary, I think, for all of us to do at some level. So, with no further ado, fasten your seatbelts because we've got a lot of slides to go through, some really excellent content. And I'm just sharing my screen here and hope to get a acknowledgement that you're seeing the screen.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're seeing it.
Okay, here we go. Jimbo, you're on.
All right. Well, yeah, my name is James Jans. Most people call me Jimbo, and I'm a hydrologist with a long-term river monitoring and continuous data unit. And along with our local partners, we also run the Watershed Pollutant Load Monitoring Network. And it's from that perspective of load monitoring where I'm going to approach the impact of climate change on our work today. Next slide. So fundamentally, climate change in Minnesota is expected to lead to more rain. Honestly, we've seen this already, right? More rain leads to higher flows. I don't think I need to elaborate on that too much. And higher flows lead to more pollutant loading, and that's where we'll get into some nuance. Right, so that's fundamentally what happens. We'll start with the climate change in Minnesota leading to more rain. Next slide. And this is the part of the presentation where I'll shamelessly steal from the Minnesota DNR climate group because they have some great stuff, and I'll include some links in the chat later. But fundamentally, our climate is becoming warmer and wetter. We know this. To the bottom right, I want to draw your attention to the 10 warmest and wettest years on record have all occurred in the past 20 years. And increases in temperature and precip are expected to continue through the century. So we will be dealing with this for a while. Next slide, please. And indeed, when we look at long-term precipitation, also from the DNR climate group, we see that, yeah, we've been increasing for a while as well. You see peaks and you see troughs. Obviously, rain is variable. This is demonstrated by our recent drought. The long-term trend, though, is clear. We are increasing in precipitation. Next slide, please. So, right, so more rain leads, and that'll lead to higher flow, of course. So how do we get to more pollutant loading? Well, math. Load equals flow times concentration. And to see how this pans out, next slide, please. We'll be looking at the Mississippi River at Red Wing / Lock and Dam number 3. And it's an important site because we have long-term data, and importantly, it's downstream of the confluence of the St. Croix and the Minnesota. So this drains a very large portion of Minnesota. Next slide. Now, to the left, we see mean annual flow. And this is inputted into a model called WRTES, ran through an R package called EGRIT. It's a very well used USGS model. So to the left is flow, and to the right is about as clear of an example of decreasing phosphorus concentrations as you are going to see. It starts in 1990, and all it does is go slowly and steadily down, which is great news, of course. But those flows are highly variable, but slightly increasing over time. Now, next slide, please. When you do that math and you do loads, we still see a decrease, but not nearly the decrease we would expect to see if we looked at concentration alone. And this shows you the power that increased precipitation and increased flows have on the amount of a pollutant that is going through our stream, in this case, phosphorus. Next slide, please. So average loading, we're going to look at the recent past for 3 different parameters at this very same site versus baseline, and we're going to be looking at 5-year moving averages. Next slide. But before we do that really quick, this is the same graphic that you just saw, but I want to draw your attention to the right of the graph, where in recent years we have had some very high flows. Obviously, this ends before the beginning of the drought, but you can see this will illustrate the impact on those high flows on loading. Next slide, please. Now, when we look at TSS or sediment, what we are looking at is when you look at the 5-year rolling average in the blue dots versus the baseline, which is established prior to this graph, the 1993 to 2005 in this case, we see that we've had a 40% increase coming to the end of this graph, and a lot of that, if not all of that increase, is due to those increasing flows at the end of the previous graph that we saw. That same period, we see a very large increase in loading in TSS. Next slide. Phosphorus, this is the same site and everything where we saw those decreasing concentrations. We see a slight increase, which when you look at those concentrations, you would not expect to see any kind of increase at all. But when we're battling against flow, obviously there's going to be some variability in increasing years, but the fact that kind of decreasing phosphorus can lead to a slight increase in load illustrates the point very clearly that flow is a big driver. Next slide. And lastly, we see similarly increasing concentration and increasing flows leads to a very large increase in loads when it comes to nitrogen. Next slide. So when we have increasing rain and increasing flow, that leads to a situation where increases in flow plus concentration means even worse loading. And we have increasing flow and decreasing concentration, we have less progress than we would like. Next slide. And that's it. I will put those links into the chat. Let me know if you have any questions. And thank you for listening.
Thanks, Jimbo. Excellent lightning round talk. Carl Stenoien, you are up. Thank you. Carl, we're not hearing you. Are you seeing your first slide?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Good. Like those old commercials. Good morning, everybody. One of the themes we're covering today is policy-related impacts. And of course, we've all been well aware of the recent passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, which really has huge implications for our progress on greenhouse gas emissions and climate change. So the question that came to my mind when thinking about how we might frame this for this water issue seminar is the basic question: will this Inflation Reduction Act impact Minnesota's water quality? The short answer of it is yes, but the long answer of it is it will do so, but indirectly. There's a huge amount of greenhouse gas emissions that are going to be avoided. It's expected that that act is going to reduce emissions by about 40% compared to 2005 levels by 2030. And without the passage of the IRA, we were on course to reduce emissions by only about 26%. So it's a big leap forward. And those reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, of course, are going to lessen the warming, not stop it or reverse it, but lessen its rate of change and those precipitation extremes as well. And therefore, that's one less stress on surface waters. We know that temperatures combined with nutrients can be especially harmful to surface waters. So reducing those temperatures and those changes in flow, like Jimbo was just talking about, can really help. An additional benefit is that 6 greenhouse gases are now officially pollutants under the Clean Air Act for many federal programs. So that's huge progress as well. Next slide, please, Lee. Another indirect benefit is through funding of several agriculture and forest management related programs. This funding is going to lead to less nutrient runoff, which also is going to lead to less stress on surface waters. There's about 20 billion for USDA conservation related programs and about 3 billion for various forestry efforts to sequester carbon and manage for resiliency. And so, of course, the main impact of these that I'm highlighting is less nutrient runoff. These plants can pull nutrients. There's going to be less erosion. There will be more organic matter in the soil, grabbing nutrients. But this also has a big effect of storing carbon in the soil, storing carbon in trees, these sorts of things. So can also lead to less warming. And that's another benefit. There are some other more water-related impacts. I wouldn't say they're directly related to Minnesota's water quality, but there's funding for coastal zone management. I wonder how that's relevant to Minnesota, but the Lake Superior is a Great Lake, and therefore that's considered a coastal zone. There's also funding for community resiliency planning and port efficiency upgrades. Lots of the equipment in ports is old diesel equipment, so there'll be funding to modernize those, make them more efficient. Next slide, please, Lee. In Minnesota, not at the federal level, but in Minnesota, there are already lots of plans happening across all levels of government. This is data from 3 versions of the Climate Adaptation Planning Survey, everything from state agencies down through cities, counties, soil and water conservation districts, townships even. And this graph just shows that 75% of all organizations surveyed have at least some type of plan. And the most common type of plan that they do have is water-related planning. So we are making progress in Minnesota. Next slide, please. And if you want to know where that planning is happening, these data are from the most recent survey, 2022. This map is showing water-related planning, percent of organizations per county that have some water-related climate adaptation planning. So you can see where the hotspots are based on at least 2 responding. That's all right. And
there we are. We're going to hear from Carl again a couple times here. So I'll kick it over to Melissa Wenzel.
Good morning, everybody. I'm going to be talking a little differently on topics. I'm a generalist. My name is Melissa Wenzel, and I'm the Built Environment Sustainability Administrator. And what that means is that trying to recognize the value in buildings, building materials, and having more sustainable building material management. So building preservation, the St. Paul office used to be a warehouse, for example, so that's a great example of adaptive reuse. But I also love to talk about e-bike life, and there's no particular speech versus slide leave, so you can advance like every 30 seconds roughly. It's just kind of a photo gallery. But I got to test ride my very first e-bike at the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. We actually had e-bikes for vehicle fleet, and nobody was using them because they didn't know it existed. So the communication staff, air quality staff did a really good job about getting the word out. And my motto has been since 2003, when I rode my first e-bike at the MPCA, you can't ride one without a smile on your face, or at least for the first time. And I knew that I wanted to sell my car and buy an e-bike. So I did move downtown St. Paul, bought an e-bike, sold my car, and have been a bike advocate and a part of the sustainability team talking about sustainable transit. Thanks to some people on this call, like Lee, we got support to actually create a sustainable transit team. We use that term to include electric vehicles in addition to telecommuting. So it's not just carpooling and biking and stuff, but we do have a policy where people can bike on work time. So that took some effort, but a really good effort to memorialize. So glad for that. And kind of my personal best is biking about an hour to get to Hennepin County, downtown Minneapolis, to bike to speak to a meeting there. And I bike as fast as I can with my e-bikes. I try not to utilize a lot of work time for it, but I figure renting a car or checking out a car and driving and parking and paying for parking, I think the agency still benefits from me biking. And of course, it's something that I do year round and literally. So when I needed to get my driver's license renewed, I was a little hesitant to do so in more populated DMVs. So I biked about 15 miles down to Cottage Grove. It's about 10 degrees out. It's not the worst. So it works. And there was a max of 7 people allowed in that particular building during COVID. So hey, it worked. So it's just something that I do, and the team, the Sustainable Transit team, actually worked to get indoor bike parking, and it was about a 10-year work in progress that launched earlier this year. So when I do go to the office, I do park my bike indoors, which I almost cried when I found out that was going to be a reality. So I do try to model good behavior in terms of living my values out loud. And so I do use this as my main mode of transportation. Our household, we do have a used electric car in our household, but my partner needs it for his U of M job, so I primarily bike pretty much everywhere. And admittedly, I'm not biking nearly as much, and the weight kind of crept up as a result. But even though I'm telecommuting, I still bike on a regular basis. And I'm definitely going to the grocery store via bicycle over lunch or after work today, because it is World Car Free Day. Elections are coming up. There are some efforts from people who actually will organize a Bike to the Polls Day for early voting. So this is me in 2020 doing that. I'm an election judge and cannot vote on election day because I vote in a different precinct where I work. The farmers market, the vendors actually recognize me either with my bike face mask when I was wearing that or my bike helmet. I get teased when I don't actually bike to the farmers market by some vendors. It's an easy way to get there, park, get your food, get your flowers, and take off. So while I don't recommend it for everybody, I do bike 26 miles round trip to donate platelets. I'm doing that again this coming Monday, and also very glad it's not 92 degrees out or upper 90s in some of the western Minnesota areas. It is a good way to bike, and it is a good way to get to places that allow flexibility for my schedule, my route, my timing, and there's really no limitation for me in Southeast St. Paul to get to my destinations because there's trails and roads and I can use both, and road construction doesn't really stop me. So I do bike year round. It's not easy. I never thought I would do it. In fact, I heard another state employee talk in 2011 about winter biking, and I was so excited to hear her and be uplifted by her winter biking, but I was actually sort of downtrodden. It didn't seem like for me, but now I've been biking year round for about 7 or 8 years. And it's just something I worked up to, and I get a lot of advice from fellow bikers. So we did kick off some of our international bike to work day events, and yeah, I have a bubble maker, so let's have bubbles. I have to say, real huge thanks to folks at the agency as well as Eco Experience staff. I was asked to create an e-bike exhibit at the Minnesota State Fair this year in the Eco Experience building, and I took that challenge very seriously and had a lot of fun creating a great exhibit. I'm hoping that you saw it. If not, I did throw a quick gallery in chat. Check it out.
Melissa, thank you. I'm being ruthless in moving us along. I was advancing your slides a little quickly, but we need to hear from everyone. So that was excellent. Thank you. We're back to Carl's.
Hello,
Carl.
Hello. I want to talk about some cool research that came out earlier this year in April. I first heard about it on NPR. Great resource for knowledge, of course, but it's been published by Gretchen Hansen at the University of Minnesota, as well as some folks from the Minnesota DNR and the Michigan DNR. And this paper is cool because they paired Cisco records, cold water fish, if you're familiar with Cisco, with the existing lake temperature and dissolved oxygen depth profiles for about 2,000 glacial lakes in the Midwest. And depending on the modeled habitat suitability for Cisco, which they're using as a proxy for good cold water habitat, they characterized about 10,000 lakes as either suitable, marginal, or unsuitable cold water habitat. Species that thrive in cold water habitats need water that's cold, obviously, but also well oxygenated. Cold isn't enough. If there's nutrient pollution in cold lakes, organic matter begins to accumulate at the bottom where the coldest water is, and the dissolved oxygen then gets used up by decomposers as they break it down, making these lakes unsuitable, even though they might still be cold. You probably all knew that. Maybe not. I'm not sure. But I'll continue. Once they had the status of each lake, they then modeled what sort of habitat that lake would be at mid-century, taking into account how the climate is expected to change, warming summer air temperatures. They also accounted for the potential for land use change as disturbance, either urbanization or conversion to ag. Either of these types of land use changes are going to lead to additional nutrient inputs. And then they also use each lake's morphometry, which is basically a value based on the ratio of depth to the surface area of the lake. Next slide, please, Lou. So they did this for 10,000 lakes. As I said, the top and the bottom panels show just a subset of different sort of representative options. So again, these are the three metrics: lake morphometry, whether a lake is deeper or shallower. For two lakes of the same surface area, the one that's deeper is going to be more likely to have suitable cold water habitat. Thinking about disturbance, as you move from left to right in each panel, the amount of disturbance increases, and the probability that any given lake moves from being suitable to marginal to unsuitable increases. So if you look at the top left one, this lake has very low amounts of disturbance currently. If there was a lot of development around this lake, even up to 100%, this lake would still be suitable habitat for these cold water species. Other lakes, as disturbance increases, they might get pushed into a less suitable or even unsuitable situation. Conversely, you could imagine that if you were to undo some of this disturbance, put land into easements, for example, you might be able to push some lakes from marginal back into suitable. On the bottom panel is sort of the same idea, but instead of disturbance along the x-axis, we have July air temperatures. The open circles are the current conditions. The closed circles are the predicted future conditions at mid-century. And again, you can see some lakes stay in suitable Others get pushed from one classification to another. Next slide, please, Lou. So based just on climate change alone, we're expected to go from the wide bars to the skinny bars. So currently there's about 1,000 lakes that have suitable habitat, but by 2050, something like a 2/3 decrease. Marginal lakes will increase and unsuitable lakes will increase. Next, please, Lee. And sort of the take-home final figure from this paper is that they classified each of these lakes. And from these classifications, we can prioritize restoration or protection efforts. So those that are the dark blue circles are the ones that don't need a lot of protection to remain resilient habitat, but those that are the lighter blue are places we probably want to prioritize avoiding conversion to agriculture or urbanization. So a cool paper, citation at the bottom, go check it out.
Thank you, Carl. Laura Milberg, you're on.
Hey, thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'm Laura Milberg. I'm the Climate Change Resilience Coordinator for the MPCA. And next slide. Today I'm going to talk during this 5 minutes about the Minnesota's Climate Action Framework, which was released last Friday with a media event headlined by Governor Walz. The framework is intended to create a bold vision for Minnesota. We wanted to invite a conversation, to organize and share our thinking while ensuring accountability, and ultimately to catalyze action across sectors. Work on the Climate Action Framework began during summer 2021. Its development was informed by a lot of public engagement, meaningful collaboration with our tribal partners, and thorough review of the input. Key messages are called out in the introductory sections and woven throughout the document. These include the fact that climate change is happening now, so we must accelerate action, which will provide an opportunity to grow our economy while improving health, equity, and the environment. The framework lays out a foundation to do this. Climate change affects everyone, but some are hit harder than others by the impacts, so we must work together to meet global goals. Next. Members of the public and the Governor's Climate Change Advisory Council expressed a priority for the state to formally adopt updated goals based on the recent Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports to align with the best science and avoid the most catastrophic impacts of climate change. Our goal in the framework is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 50% by 2030, achieve net zero emissions by 2050, address adaptation, prioritizing investment in the next 10 years. The framework also contextualizes these goals by discussing the need for action across all levels of government, businesses, nonprofits, and individuals. Adopting these IPCC targets was really quite a big deal. Next slide. The framework is organized around 6 goals. Each goal contains specific numerical targets by a certain year to measure progress and its own section on equity. From left to right in the graphic, the first goal is to connect and serve all people through a safe, equitable, and sustainable transportation system. The second goal is to enhance climate benefits by absorbing and storing carbon, reducing emissions, and sustaining resilient landscapes. The third goal is to provide each community with tools to plan for and become resilient to its unique climate impacts. The fourth goal is to expand the use of carbon-free energy and create buildings that are cheaper to operate and pollute less. The fifth goal is to protect the health and well-being of Minnesotans in the face of climate change. And the last goal is to build a thriving carbon-neutral economy that produces goods and services with environmental benefit and equitably provides family-sustaining job opportunities. Next. Publishing the framework is a milestone, not the end. Implementing the action steps for budget and policy development, advancing policy and programs, and measuring and reporting progress are critical to achieving our climate goals. The framework provides 4 pillars of how we will prioritize these climate efforts. Impact, which will be gauged by using the best science and analysis to identify actions with substantial greenhouse gas reduction and/or resiliency potential. and then equity, economy, and health and the environment. Thanks, that's all.
Excellent. Thank you, Laura. It's exciting to hear about that framework. So if you're getting tired of hearing from Carl, which I'm sure you're not, this is the last segment that Carl's on for. Go ahead, Carl.
I promise. Yes. The one bit of inspiration that I'd like to share is just considering whether your roof might be suitable for residential solar. The reason I looked into it was really a single goal, which was to reduce my greenhouse gas emissions. I see it as my responsibility to right size my environmental footprint. As an American, I have an outsized historical and current per capita impact on climate change. As an ecologist and a nature lover, I'm deeply saddened by the extinctions and devastation to come to our ecosystems, which can only adapt on evolutionary timescales. And then as a global citizen and a parent, we have a responsibility to do what's right. Maybe you feel similarly in at least one regard. But then I looked into the financial side of it and realized it really was a win-win. So I'll step down from my soapbox now. Next slide, please, Lee. This system we just had installed this summer. We ended up doing 12 panels with 2 arrays, one on the south side and one on the west side of our house. This is the top view of our house. It's expected to produce about 103% of our annual electricity use. Air conditioning and cooking are our biggest uses. We did not opt to include battery storage, despite how much fun it would be to be the neighborhood cell phone charging hub. We do not have battery storage. So when the power goes out, our panels are also cut off because we don't want to be sending electricity to the grid and hurting any line workers. We signed a purchase agreement in January. We ended up going with All Energy Solar. Not necessarily a recommendation, but we did have a good experience with them. The sticker price was $14,500. I'll talk a bit about some of the financial incentives that bring that cost down for you. The panels were actually installed in June. Crew of 5 guys took them one day, and in July, Excel finally got out and basically flipped the switch, and we've been harnessing the power of the sun ever since then. Next slide, please, Lee. So some considerations you might want to think about is just whether your site, either your home or your land, has good potential. You can look at this website Sunroof, which is hosted by Google. You want to consider how big your system should be based on basically the potential of your site, but also how much electricity you use might be an important thing to consider. Whether you want battery storage or not, it adds quite a bit to the cost. But if you're into being independent, you want to have power when the grid doesn't have power, that's a great option. Choosing an installer. Panels are typically guaranteed for at least 25 years, but they will last over 30 years. And here are those financial incentives I mentioned. When we installed, we expected a 26% federal tax credit, but since the Inflation Reduction Act, there it is again, we actually now get 30%, and that 30% is in effect, I think, for the next 10 years. Minnesota has net metering, which means you can sell any excess power you make to the grid at the same price you buy it, which is pretty great. And then there's also a program through Excel. I spelled Excel wrong there. Noe at the beginning, called Solar Rewards Program. I'm not sure whether all utilities have similar ones, but through that agreement, we get an extra 4 cents per kilowatt hour produced for 10 years. At the onset of the project, we expected the financial break-even point to be somewhere in like the 10-year range. Since the increased tax credit and the increasing energy costs, it's probably actually going to be sooner than that. There's also quite a bit of discussion about whether solar panels increase home values or not. It seems like they do. And there's also lots of various financing options. You can even lease panels. There are solar specific loans. So even if residential solar won't work for you, maybe you could consider joining Community Solar Garden. talking to your landlord about putting panels on your building or other renewable energy programs. If I could share real quickly, maybe I don't have time. I'll skip it. I was going to show you our data. It comes in 15-minute increments. It's pretty fun, but for the sake of others, I'm going to be quiet.
If we have a few minutes at the end, Carl, which I'm not sure we will go to that. So Matt, this is where you need to share, right? So I'm going to stop sharing.
Hi, I'm Matt Linden. I work in our effluent limit setting team, and I've done a lot of stuff over the years with lakes, specifically eutrophication. And when I was asked to try to talk about blooms and talk about how they connect to climate change, it was kind of a, something that I know a lot of people have been talking about for quite a while, and thinking about all the things that you could do to try to look at that is, it's a little challenging. And just the term, just in general, bloom, I think oftentimes gets people down different paths. Sometimes people are thinking in the terms of like, surface water, kind of a scum that'll pop up here and there over time, and how, climate change could be adding to more of those. There's also other folks that talk about algal blooms in terms of like, just certain concentrations of chlorophyll. So it's a tricky thing to try to, define blooms in everyone's language or everyone's understanding. And then, all the complications with blooms are, all the dynamics of what's going on in our lakes, and what causes blooms, and what, moves in this direction of blooms is, a variety of things in addition to lake temperature profile dynamics, rainfall, all those other nutrient type components to blooms that you have to kind of take into account as well. But one of the things I thought I would highlight here, and this is actually Carl, our previous speaker, some of his good work, is another dynamic that I think people are thinking about when they're thinking about algal blooms and connection to climate change. And this is Carl's work about ice duration, and then plot out on ice out and ice in trends, and thinking about how that affects the algal community. You get an earlier start in the spring when that ice goes out earlier, and you can see, Carl's data.
I cannot
Yeah.
see your slides.
Matt?
Yeah.
We can't see your screen, so
Yeah.
you seem to be describing a picture, and if you could try to share your screen.
Share it again here. It does show that it's sharing. Let me try it one more time.
There we go. It looks like it's
All right. Sorry about that. So you can see Carl's work here on the ice out duration, and then the same thing with ice in and ice out trends. Those type of things show that we have kind of a trend towards the earlier ice outs and more open water season, which of course would lead to more algal activities and changes in the algal community. So that's a thing I think that relates to the topic we're talking about here with algal bloom trends. And a couple other quick slides here just to show somewhat of the complexities of we're looking at this data. So people think of algal trends. I think oftentimes bloom, they're thinking the summer, but we've got data on chlorophyll throughout the whole year. And this is just a summary of all of our data. And you can see how, from month to month, it's going to vary of all of our chlorophyll data. And then here you can see, over a stretch of time, this is, 93 to 2022, chlorophyll data as a measure of an algal bloom, it varies. And we don't really have this kind of de-aggregated in a way that I think would show trends of individual lakes. This is just a big snapshot of all lakes and all chlorophyll data. So, it's far from kind of getting to that kind of level of detail that I think you could make that kind of conclusion, but just showing you what we're looking at from the big picture. And this is monthly trends over a big period of time from 94 to 2022, just in that summer window where a lot of people I think are most concerned about algal blooms when they're generally talking about, you know, things like climate change and effects on lakes. But you can see that data shows, you know, quite a bit of variability. It does need to kind of get teased out a little bit before we say anything more definitively. I would also say a lot of times people, when they talk about algal blooms, they also are thinking about toxic algae blooms, and there's a, you know, always an interest in whether or not there's more of those and how many complaints we get from year to year, and that's also a tricky thing that varies from year to year quite a bit. You know, the extent of those harmful algal blooms problems varies from year to year, but since it's more of a complicated thing with just the amount of complaints that we get, it's not really, the complaints isn't really a measure of what's really going on in the environment. So that adds another layer of complication to it. But I would say it is a topic that, you know, our lakes lateral team at the agency is working on. And I think we're continuing to kind of try to connect in climate change and algal blooms in newer ways. I'll stop.
Excellent. Matt, thank you. And you are going to hear from Matt again in just a minute. So I'm going to go back to screen sharing here. And let's see. Give me a holler if you got my screen again.
Yep.
Yes, we have it.
Okay, we are back to Laura Milberg for the Positive Policy Program News number 3.
Next slide.
Excellent. Here we go.
So the climate section, led by Climate Director Frank Kolash, was created in early 2022 for 3 main purposes: to accelerate progress on goals for greenhouse gas reduction and resiliency, to support interagency coordination required by the governor's executive order, and to help identify forward-looking strategic goals, measurements, and policy options. The new section brought together climate adaptation staff, Sharon Stevens and myself from RMAD, and air policy staff, Amanda Smith, Peter Soborowski, and Ann Claflin, already in EAO. It includes only 1 unit to start, led by Amanda Smith, who recently accepted the supervisor position. In April, we brought on Amy Duchesne as grants coordinator, a newly created position. With Peter's retirement and Amanda's promotion, the unit has had 2 unfilled positions. One of those positions, a new climate and energy coordinator, is open now for applications until October 14th. So be sure to look that up if you might be interested. The climate unit had a big role in driving creation of the climate action framework, and I put the link to it in the chat a couple minutes ago. Next slide. The 2021 legislative session funded a new grant program for local government water infrastructure. In fiscal year 2022, the request for proposals received 49 applications, asking for a total of just under $3 million. This past March, 12 grantees were awarded a total of $920,000, mostly for projects with stormwater modeling and evaluation of options to address localized flooding from more frequent, intense precipitation. A couple of the funded projects address planning for urban heat island mitigation, and 1 project combines planning for all 3 categories. Next. The 12 stormwater, wastewater, and community resilience planning projects funded in FY22 reach all areas of the state. MPCA Commissioner Kessler traveled to Moorhead, the Cloquet-Duluth area, and the Austin-Cedar River watershed area this summer to draw attention to the importance of planning for climate adaptation and resilience. This fall 2022, 3 separate requests for proposals will utilize the fiscal year 23 appropriation to support planning of resilient stormwater, wastewater, and community infrastructure. An RFP targeted at small communities under 10,000 is open right now. Check the MPCA website for more information and upcoming opportunities. Next. The MPCA is contracted with the University of Minnesota Climate Adaptation Partnership to develop state-level resilience metrics by June 2023. The project involves compilation of metrics from other states, interviews, identification of potential processes and outcomes, workshops, and synthesis of research results into a set of priority climate resilience metrics. Next slide. In addition to new resilience grant funding, the 2021 Minnesota legislative session also funded an agriculture and weather study by the University of Minnesota, which will generate future climate projections for use across Minnesota's diverse sectors, from agriculture and forestry to water resources management and the built environment. It is particularly important in Minnesota to differentiate the impacts of climate change at a fine spatial scale because we have large south to north gradients and warming, long duration snow cover, large and small lakes, and other complexities that affect our climate. This project will produce climate projections at approximately 3-mile resolution for the entire state. These data will be available to the public through an interactive web tool with projections for 3 future climate scenarios during 3 time steps: mid-century starting 2040, late century, and end of century entering 2100. The computer modeling is underway at the Minnesota Supercomputing Institute. Focus groups have been conducted with data users to inform the design and anticipated use of the interactive data tool. Next slide. Just to quickly show you, the University of Minnesota is still working to finalize the output variables that will be available based on end user input and computational limitations. This graphic shows the current proposed variables. Additional variables may also include lake temperature and evaporation rates. Model analysis will be completed by January 2023. An online data tool will be live by December 2023. Next slide. Last but not least, I just wanted to show you that MPCA piloted its first drone missions in 2021 for biomonitoring and other programs with big benefits for efficiency, effectiveness, and staff safety at MPCA. These photos show how drones can provide unparalleled documentation of erosion and sedimentation, increasingly made worse by climate change. The right-hand photo is the Rainy River ice break this spring. Climate unit staff participates on the drone team. We provided funding to purchase drones which photograph the thermal spectrum and measure temperature differences. More on that in the future. Thanks.
Laura, thank you. Excellent presentation. And our final what can you do presentation, we're back to Matt Linden. So Matt, I've got the slides this time and I'll just advance through on your direction.
All right, so I'm going to quickly just kind of give you an overview of plug-in hybrids. I'll talk about how plug-in hybrid electric vehicles, these PHEVs, compared to other hybrids, other cars, and EVs in efficiency, emissions, driving range, charging, total costs, savings. And I'll talk about my experience. I've owned one for almost 5 years now. And so that's it. Let's go. Next slide. So just quickly talking about these different types of vehicles, you know, this gas engine, internal combustion engines, the IC is kind of the new nomenclature for folks are using. That's one we're all pretty common with, but then, you know, in the last 20 years, people have seen hybrids, which are the nomenclature's HEVs now, and then you can go on to these plug-in hybrid vehicles, which have, you know, a portion of the drive time you can go on all battery, and there's, of course, you know, more and more of these type of vehicles coming out. And then, of course, last is all EV vehicles where there is no internal combustion engine and it's all electric. And we'll talk a little bit about those as well. Let's go ahead here. So as you kind of move away from the normal MPG world of miles per gallon, you have to start to kind of understand a little bit more of how these vehicles are kind of ranked and how to compare one to another. So there's this term out there that was relatively new to me, MPGE, which is miles per gallon equivalent. And that is based on the amount of energy you can generate from a gallon of gas. So now you can compare, you know, electrical energy to a gallon of gas kind of equivalents. And that's one way you can start to look at, you know, not only relative pollution, but also, you know, energy from one to another. So that's useful to understand what that MPGE is. And then if you go over to the next part here, this is kilowatt per hour per 100 miles. So this is, you know, how much energy does it take a vehicle to go 100 miles? And that's also a new thing for a lot of folks to try to think about. And it's really helpful to compare one EV to another. And this will be helpful when you start to look at stickers if you're at this. So go next slide. So when you're at a dealership or when you're looking at used vehicles and you start to look at these numbers, you know, now those numbers will mean something and you can compare one vehicle to another. This is a sticker from a plug-in hybrid vehicle, and it has a couple of numbers here that hopefully will make a little more sense to you now. That 93 mpge is for when the plug-in hybrid is all electric. So that's a measure of you know, how much you can get per the battery portion, and then once the battery portion runs out, then that vehicle would shift into being a hybrid where it's using gas, and then it would get 37 mpg. You know, further down the sticker, it gives you some helpful other information about comparing to other vehicles or looking at how often you charge it. In my case, you know, my vehicle had a mpg rating of 133, and I had a miles per gallon rating of 57, or I'm sorry, 56. And over the 5 years that I've owned it, now I'm averaging about 80 mpg. So what it does, the car itself calculates your kind of combined mpg based on, you know, when you're on all battery and when you're on gas. And I'm mostly on all battery. But I'm doing my best to stay on all battery, but the combined for me over the 5-year life of the vehicle has been about 80 mpg. So helpful things to just know. So go ahead and go to the next slide here. This is super interesting, and I don't know if we'll have time to click into this here, but this chart was put up by MIT a while back, but it gives you a kind of a look of all the current vehicles and their types. So up in the top, the brown and or the gray and black are these internal combustion engine type cars, and you can see, you know, that talks about their ownership in terms of how much it costs to own those vehicles per month. And then on the left, on the y-axis, it talks about greenhouse gases emissions. So you can see those vehicles, those internal combustion vehicles, are very high comparative to the hybrid and to the all electrics, which are the, you know, the red and yellow dots. And if you go to the, you know, bottom left corner, you can see those are the least expensive vehicles. If you go to this website, which I don't, maybe we'll have time after or down here, you can actually see, you know, individual vehicle comparatives. So you can click on an electric vehicle, look at its overall cost. You can compare that to a plug-in hybrid vehicle and compare it in cost as well as emissions. Well, so, and you can see that some of those plug-in hybrid vehicles are actually very comparative to all electric vehicles. In some cases, they're better than all electric vehicles in this way of looking at it. So it's something to check out if you're considering your next car. And in my case, I actually calculated how much CO2 I saved, if you go back there real quick, over the lifespan of the car so far, and I've saved greenhouse gases as opposed to my prior vehicle, which wasn't an inefficient vehicle. It was an internal combustion engine, but it was a small car. I've saved 3,400 CO2 equivalents. So it's made a major difference in the emissions that I've put out over the 5 years. So next slide. I won't go into this either, but there's awesome tools out there to help you select here. This is an Xcel Energy one that actually will actually help you pick a car for EV or for plug-in hybrid. So here you can put in what your typical commute is. You can put in how many, you know, passengers you need. You can say your relative budget, and it will rate out new cars or even give you recommended used cars. And you can even base it on what type of home charging you want. So anyways, next slide. Yeah, I saved over $900 in total cost compared to my prior vehicle once you do the math on energy costs. In addition to cost, there's also cost of charging the vehicle. This is just a quick slide that shows you that's very dependent on your home rates, and off-peak is an option, and we've used that off-peak option to try to reduce the costs in our charging our home vehicle. And there's a website here that you can use to calculate your home charging costs. So I think for me, it hasn't turned out to make a huge difference in my energy bill, but I do feel like using off-peak helps out as far as emissions goes from, you know, my local power provider. Next slide. Okay, that's it.
That's it, and we're right at 10 o'clock. I'm I'm sorry we didn't we didn't get to questions and discussion, but I'm very happy that we were able to get through all the presentations, and want to thank all the presenters for doing an excellent job, and all of you for being here. So Water Issues Forum people, Mark, Brooke, Katie, do you guys want to say anything to close it out?
I'll just jump in really quick. That was fascinating set of talks. I was kind of skeptical that you guys could get through all of that, but I'm amazed, and I learned more in an hour than I think I've learned in several months. Thanks for giving them.
Okay, well, with that, I guess goodbye to everyone.
We do have a hand raised if
Oh.
anyone has a few minutes to stick around.
Yeah, okay, good. I was hoping you might say that. Yeah, if people can stay, let's talk for a little while. Okay.
Yeah. So I'm gonna go ahead and let's start with Karsten's got a hand raised. So if you want to go ahead, should be able to unmute yourself.
Is it me?
Yes, your hand is raised.
Oh no, I just sent a thing that says oh, I see now. I accidentally I sent the thumbs up earlier and then and my hand raised. No, I just said thank you for the info. Sorry about that.
No, not a problem. I think Ada has her hand raised.
Again, that was a mistake. I was just clapping, saying thank you to
Everyone's
everybody.
trying to clap, but they're raising their hand, I guess. That's all right. Well, if we have anyone else that does have any questions and our presenters can stick around, feel free to just unmute yourselves and go for it.
Well, actually, there's a question that Scott asked that I would like to reiterate. Carl, why didn't you get the battery as well with your photovoltaic system? I was curious about that too. I kind of think I know the answer to that, but it'd be interesting to hear your answer.
Yeah, my goal, as I sort of stated, was to reduce my environmental footprint as much as I could, and I guess to do it in a dollar efficient way. And the environmental benefit of adding batteries is low. There's a little bit of efficiency lost as you store energy and release it from a battery, but mostly we have a pretty stable grid here. We don't see many power outages, and I don't feel like it's that critical to be prepared for power outages in St. Paul, and it's a huge cost increase. So in terms of environmental benefit per dollar, the calculus didn't work out for me. But if you like batteries, go for it. The prices are coming down all the time, and the technology is getting much, much better. So someday we'll all have big batteries in our houses.
And the batteries are really wonderful for public facilities, places that need to be there as refuge or shelters. So it's a great development, but maybe not as important for individual use.
We got a couple more hands raised, so I'll just let you guys, if you intended to raise your hand, go ahead and unmute.
Yeah, hi, this is Braden. I have a question for Carl regarding the solar installations experience. So I guess it seems like the solar installer that you went with ended up working out for you. It looks like an installation that's really going to pay off for you. I was just wondering if you've heard about anyone or you yourself had an experience with a solar installer that maybe was aiming a little bit more for profit than payoff. I have heard quite a bit about some more predatory solar installers that are really kind of just aiming to make a lot of money, not really about production quality, installation quality. Do you have any thoughts on kind of being a little more critical for consumer choice about which solar installer you're going with?
Yeah, good question, Braden. I think I've heard of some of those more predatory companies. Perhaps they're based out of someplace like Utah and show up in your neighborhood at your door. That's basically why we ended up going with All Energy Solar. They're a long established local company that's done a lot of good work. I had a friend who's a solar developer, and he recommended them. Ganske, I think you also went with All Energy Solar.
Yes.
I think probably the majority of houses in the Twin Cities that have solar were installed by All Energy, but there's certainly a lot of other companies cropping up, and you should do your due diligence to check out a few. There's different sort of installation setups too, like some that don't need to put holes in your roof. Yeah, good question, Braden.
Hi, this is Karen Kromar. I had a question for Carl as well. I've heard that squirrels can be a problem, damaging solar panels on the roofs. Do you have anything knowledge of that?
Hope not, but it's plausible. Maybe somebody with more experience has some input. I know they chew on our like decorative yard lights. We have yard squirrel issues.
We have not had squirrel issues. Thought about it, and it is possible, I think, in a typical rooftop installation to add squirrel protection, where you essentially create a, I don't know, like a hardware cloth grid or barrier around your panels. I think it's a pretty simple process, but squirrels are awfully crafty, so but we've had no problem for several years, and there's plenty of squirrels around our yard. And
Hi, thanks everybody for the talks. I just had a quick question for Jimbo about phosphorus loading. You mentioned at the beginning of your talk that there's been a reduction over time in phosphorus concentration in runoff water. And I'm just curious if if any of that could be due to like some kind of dilution effect from the increase in total rain or total flow. Or if that's more a signal of just reduced like source of phosphorus.
That is a fantastic question. Absolutely. Dilution effect is a real thing, and we do see that in our modeling from time to time. Especially you'll see it when it gets to really high flows and events. You'll see different sites. Some of them will follow flow perfectly. I am one of the hats I happen to wear is I'm also the trend guy for our network. So what I see is I actually calculate both flow adjusted and non-flow adjusted trends. Part of that is because it answers that question to some degree. And what we find is that I'm not familiar off the top of my head with that site specifically, but across the state we see general reductions in phosphorus. And those reductions persist whether you adjust for flow or whether you don't adjust for flow. So what that means to me is that those reductions are real. They're it does account for flow in some cases. Either way you look at it, phosphorus does appear to be going down. Unfortunately, nitrogen tends to be going the other way, so it's not all good news. But yeah, that's a fantastic question, and it's something we always keep in mind too, right? It's hard sometimes to parse those things apart, and those flow adjusted versus non-flow adjusted trends is the way that I try to do that. Does that make sense?
That does. Thank you so much.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Right, well, I don't see any more hands raised. So unless anyone else has some questions, we can maybe wrap things up here.
That was great. Thanks, everybody.